To our muscle structure and physiology. So we broke it up into three parts. So the first part we looked at the structure, the next part we looked at how do we get the muscle to contract, and then the last part we just have to look at the energy that we need to fire our muscles, and we're going to just look at a couple little definitions. And this is the last audio lecture that we have to kind of cover before we get to our next unit exams, okay? And then we're going to move on to the neurological system, and again, after this weekend, after you guys take your unit 2, you are halfway through the course. Okay, so this course is really kind of flying by. So let's start off with the definitions here. Okay, so we have a couple more definitions that we have to kind of look at, and these ones are pretty easy compared to all the other ones that we had in this chapter. And some of these you'll probably be already familiar with. Okay, so we looked at how do we create these contractions, and now we want to look at the different types of contractions. Okay, so you have two different types. You have isotonic contractions versus isometric contractions, and again, these are really good multiple choice questions. Okay, so you really want to just make sure that you kind of know that these are the two types, and then we're going to look at how they kind of differ, and I'm going to try to show you sort of what the important differences kind of are. So these are the isotonic contractions, okay? And the thing you want to remember with the isotonic is that the muscle is actually going to change length, okay? So for one of them, the muscle is going to change length, and for the other one, it's going to contract, but the muscle length is going to stay the same, okay? So the isotonic one is the one where the muscle is actually going to change length. So it's going to lengthen or it's going to shorten. And when we're talking about contractions, we're talking about producing force or we're talking about producing tension. So for this one, there's enough tension or force created to produce motion or to move something, right? Or to move my joint. So I can flex my joint, I can extend my joint, I can pick something up. But again, the biggest thing to remember with the isotonic contractions is that the muscle length is going to change, okay? And then there's two types of isotonic contractions. You're going to have concentric and you're going to have eccentric. Again, good multiple choice questions. When I have a concentric isotonic contraction, the muscle is going to shorten, and this is the one that we think about most of the time, and this is the one that we think about kind of when we go to the gym and we do our curls and we do our extensions and we do all these different little things, is that we're actually shortening the muscle when we're producing this power, okay? So this is if my arm is straight and I'm doing a bicep curl and my arm starts off as straight and then I flex my elbow and my bicep shortens as I lift that weight up or I curl that weight, okay? Eccentric is the opposite one. This is where I'm going to generate force, but I'm going to do so as I lengthen my muscle, okay? And the bicep is a good one to kind of get these two, under control and kind of make sure that you understand, okay? So when I do a bicep curl and I'm standing and I'm holding the weight and my arms are straight and then I curl that weight up and I flex my elbow, that is going to be a concentric contraction. My bicep is going to concentrically contract to kind of curl that weight and sort of move that joint and bring it into flexion. Okay, now when I'm lowering the bar back down, so now I have the bar curled and my elbows are bent and I'm going to slowly kind of lower that weight. It's still going to be my bicep, okay, that's kind of doing the action or controlling the motion, but now my bicep is working in this eccentric way, or it's working as it's kind of lengthening. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, when I'm doing a bicep curl and I curl the weights up, that's the concentric part and that's the bicep, and when I extend my arms and I lower the weight, that I actually switch to my tricep muscle, okay? But if you fired your tricep when your arms are bent, the joint is going to straighten too quickly and that weight's going to kind of move too quickly. So if you're not believing me when I'm sort of telling you that it's the bicep that controls that lowering, you can kind of pick something up and kind of do it at home. Curl it and then lower it and then kind of watch what muscle is still working. And again, it's going to be that bicep, but in this way it's working eccentrically, or it's working while it lengthens. So the important part to remember is, again, I have two types of contractions. This one is the isotonic one, and then I have two types of isotonic contractions. Concentric, the muscle is working when it shortens, and then I have eccentric, and this is going to be the muscle, and it's going to be working when it lengthens. If you want another example, probably one of the best examples in just sports in general is kind of when I'm running. And the eccentric training, training people eccentrically for muscles has become a really popular thing in the last little bit as a way to sort of avoid injuries. But if you think about running, and when I think about when I'm pushing off and I'm sort of bringing my leg through, okay, the job of my hamstring in running is really to sort of slow down that extension of my knee when I'm running and sort of allow me to get my foot back down to the ground so that I can kind of push off again. The problem that we run into, and the problem, or the reason that people have so many hamstring injuries in sort of sprinting and long distance running, is that we don't train the hamstring like that. So even though we know that in running, right, the hamstring's job is going to sort of work as it's lengthening, we train it concentrically, or we always kind of are strengthening it in this shortening sort of exercises. and we're not sort of training it to do what it's going to do when we're in our activities, okay? And so this is one of those things where you have to be really, really specific, and where you have to sort of get really good at kind of analyzing sports and kind of understanding what is this muscle doing in my activity, and then you want to train it that way. So if you know that during your activity your muscle is going to work eccentrically, or it's going to work as it lengthens, then in your training and your strength training and all the other things that you do to sort of supplement your sport, you want to train it in that way too. And that's the best way to kind of prevent injuries, okay? And for the longest time, all we did was train muscles concentrically, and we thought this would help to prevent these injuries. But again, we've learned that it's only helpful to train them concentrically if that's the way they're going to work in your normal activity. Okay, so now we get to the isometric ones, and these are going to be the opposite. We're still going to produce tension, or we're going to produce force, but the muscle is neither going to shorten or lengthen. Okay, so it's going to stay the same length. No length changes in this one. We do form cross bridges, okay, but there's no sliding. And the way that I always used to remember this is that you have isometric, and you have this I, and you have this M in there, and then you can have this IM, and that's going to mean that this one is going to be immovable, okay? And this also happens when I'm trying to lift something and it's just too heavy for me, or if I'm pushing up against the wall and you can kind of push into your desk, or you can pull up on something. The muscle is still going to fire, but there's no changes in that shortening or that lengthening. There's going to be no movement of the joints, okay? So again, good multiple choice questions. Isometric exercises are really good if you're coming back from an injury, and you want to just kind of fire the muscle and you want to keep the muscle strong, but you don't want to necessarily go through the full ranges of motion for the joints. Other than that, they're not super helpful, because again, they're going to be, your muscle is going to only get strong in this very specific range of motion. And again, we want to train our muscles throughout their full range of motion. We want to make sure that we're keeping as much motion in those joints as possible, so that we're keeping that cartilage and we're keeping those muscles and those bones as healthy as possible. Okay, so these ones have kind of limited usefulness, okay, but very helpful. Say if I break a bone, or I tear some ligaments, or I have some knee surgeries, and I just again want to keep my muscle strong, but I'm afraid to sort of put it through that full range of motion. Okay, so now we get to the tricky part of this part of the chapter, and that's going to be the energy systems. And we're going to look at sort of, again, we're using ATP, and we have to have all these different ways to sort of create this ATP. And it's all going to be based, again, on how quickly do you need this energy, and sort of how much time do you have to sort of supply it to your muscles. And again, I want you to keep it really simple, and we're going to look at the three ways that we kind of do this. And again, the main thing you want to pay attention to is, what am I using in each one of these little systems here to create my ATP, because again, those are always good multiple choice questions. Okay, so again, we're using ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. The triphosphate is going to be the most important part of this ATP molecule, okay, because what's going to happen is, the way we're going to create energy is we're going to break one of these bonds, and we're going to turn ATP into an ADP, and then we're just going to turn it back into ADP. We're going to break the bond again, use it up, break the bond again, and then sort of rebuild it up. So it's just this process of breaking this ATP molecule and then replenishing it and then sort of breaking it again. But it's going to come down to, this phosphate group is going to be the one, when we break it, is going to supply us with all this energy. So it provides energy to move and detach cross bridges. We looked at that when we looked at the myosin and the actin. It's going to also operate our calcium pump, okay, for our sarcoplasmic reticulum, again, which stores all our calcium. Muscles store very little reserves of ATP, so we actually have some ATP just stored in our muscles, but it's only going to last us for about this 4 to 6 seconds of activity, okay? But ATP is the only source of energy used directly for contractions, okay? But we're going to run out real quick. So what happens is, this ATP, again, is going to be broken down. It's a triphosphate, and then when we break off that one phosphate bond, it's going to become a diphosphate, so ADP, and therefore we must regenerate it quickly for these contractions to continue. So after 4 to 6 seconds, we have to find a new source of ATP, and we have to sort of replenish the ATP that we've sort of used up. Okay, and we can use 3 processes for this. So ATP is regenerated very quickly by these 3 processes. Okay, and again, we're talking about breaking this bond here and turning this ATP into an ADP, or a diphosphate. Okay, so here are 3 pathways to regenerate ATP. We're going to use direct phosphorylation, we're going to use anaerobic pathways, and then we're going to use aerobic pathways. And again, we're going to look at each one of these individually, but a lot of the questions just come for, okay, do you know what you're using in direct phosphorylation to sort of restore that phosphate, or what are we using in anaerobic pathway, or what are we using in the aerobic pathway? So again, those are the parts that you don't necessarily need to know the exact steps, but you want to know exactly what are we using in each of these pathways to regenerate ATP. So with direct phosphorylation, and again, the name kind of tells you what you're doing. You're just directly giving back a phosphate. Okay, so I turned ATP into ADP, and this is my fastest way that I can just give back a phosphate, and I can turn it back into ATP. But in this pathway, we're using creatine, okay? And most of us have heard of creatine if you work out, and you'll heard that a lot of people sort of take creatine as a supplement, and what they're trying to do is sort of build up this creatine in their body so that these phosphates are more readily available, okay? So good for kind of high intensity activities, right? So really, really heavy lifting, jumping, squatting, things like that. So creatine phosphate, or CP, is a high energy molecule. It's going to be stored in your muscle. Okay, your muscle cells store 2 to 3 times more creatine phosphate than they have of ATP. And then together, ATP and creatine phosphate provide max muscle power for approximately 15 seconds. So I have 4 to 6 seconds of ATP stored up, and then using this direct phosphorylation or this creatine phosphate is going to get me up to about 15 seconds. Okay, and then my creatine phosphate reserves are going to be replenished during periods of rest from our activity. And we all kind of know this because we can do, say we're doing bench press and we do a set of, 5 to 6 really, really heavy bench presses. If I take 2 to 3 or 4 to 5 minutes off, I can come back and I can do another 5 sets. So we kind of realize that as long as I'm done before this 15 seconds are up, this is the system that I can kind of use to replenish that ATP. So it's creatine phosphate plus ADP, the diphosphate, and again, I'm going to give one of these phosphate to the ADP, and I'm going to end up with creatine, and I'm going to be back to this ATP molecule that I can use for energy again. Okay, so here's another little picture of direct phosphorylation, and again, you want to make sure that you know that I'm using creatine to restore that phosphate, and again, it gets me up to about 15 seconds of activity. So once ATP and creatine phosphate are exhausted, and if I'm still being active or if more ATP is needed, I'm going to get my energy through breaking down glucose. Okay, and everything we eat in our body, we're going to break down and we're going to turn it into glucose and we're going to put it into our bloodstream, and then we can use it as energy. Okay, and if I have too much glucose in my bloodstream, I'm going to store it as glycogen, or I'm going to store it as fat. But everything, if I want a usable source of energy, I have to break all those nutrients down into glucose. Okay, so glucose needed is obtained from our blood or stored in our muscle glycogen. Okay, we use 2 pathways based on energy needs, and we're going to still, again, we're using glucose, but we're going to use 2 pathways, and one is going to be aerobic, and that's always going to mean that it's going to use oxygen, and one is going to be anaerobic, and again, it's going to come based on, it says based on energy needs, and again, it's based on how quickly do I need this energy and what is really my intensity of my workouts. So glucose is always broken down into 2 pyruvate, or 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, so PA, or pyruvic acid. So if demands are low, and this is the important part. So if demands are low, and I have enough pyruvic acid, can enter the aerobic pathway. Okay, so if I'm not exercising at a super high level, and the demands for this energy are a little bit lower, I can take these pyruvic acids and I can enter them into this aerobic pathway, which is going to take place in our mitochondria, and it's going to allow me to produce a lot of ATP. Okay, but if my demands are high, okay, and the blood flow and oxygen delivery is impaired, so this is where I'm still exercising really vigorously, right? I don't have time to use this aerobic pathway. I'm going to take these pyruvic acids and I'm going to use this lactic acid pathway or this anaerobic pathway. Okay, and usually I'm going to have to switch over to this anaerobic pathway if the intensity of my workouts are greater than the 70% of what my maximum ability is. And we all kind of, when we're running, you kind of know when you've kind of turned it up into a higher level, and when you start to fatigue a little bit faster. And that's a good way to kind of tell, if I can run and I can maintain a certain level and I'm not working really, really hard. A lot of times we talk about the conversational pace, and as we pick up that pace, it gets harder and harder to talk. But again, it's all based on how quickly do I need that energy. And if I don't need it really fast, I'm going to use this aerobic pathway. If I need that energy a lot quicker, I'm going to have to use this anaerobic or this lactic acid pathway. So here is my lactic acid pathway, and it talks about glycolysis because this is going to be that breaking down of my glucose. Okay, so the lactic acid pathway is termed anaerobic glycolysis, and again, anaerobic is always going to mean you're not requiring oxygen. Once created, more lactic acid diffuses out of the muscles. Okay, it's going to flow into your bloodstream. It's going to be picked up by your heart, your liver, your kidneys, and then I can use that to produce more energy. But again, this byproduct here is a lot of times what kind of makes it where we sort of feel like we have to sort of slow down, and we sort of feel like our intensity is a little bit too high. And a lot of times that feeling of I need to sort of slow down or I need to kind of stop is this buildup of these byproducts. Okay. So here is my anaerobic pathway, and this is the important part of understanding sort of why we want to kind of use the aerobic pathway if at all possible. Okay, so my anaerobic pathway creates only about 5% as much ATP from glucose as the aerobic pathway. Okay, so again, if I can use my aerobic pathway, I'm going to get way more ATP from that glucose that I broke down into the pyruvic acid. If I have to use my anaerobic pathway, I'm going to take those two pyruvic acids, but I'm only going to get about 5% as much glucose, which is a huge loss, right? So I don't produce as much glucose, but I produce it 2 to 5 times faster. And for me, when with coaching cross country, the biggest mistake kids kind of make when they're running is that they do that first mile, that first half mile really, really fast. And it's really hard to get them to kind of understand why that's so detrimental. But this is why it's detrimental. If I go out at a really, really fast pace and I burn up all my glucose, it's not there for me to use later. And I've gotten 5% as much energy as if I would have just went out a little bit slower. I could have gotten a way, way, way more amount of energy and ATP from that same amount of glucose. Okay, so you've kind of burned it up, and then again, it's not there for you to use kind of later. So I produce large amounts of ATP needed for 30 to 40 seconds of strenuous activity. So again, anaerobic pathway, you look at your ATP you have stored, you look at your direct phosphorylation, you look at your anaerobic pathway. I'm still only getting up to about a minute of this high intensity or this strenuous activity. Okay, so together ATP, creatine phosphate, lactic acid pathway can support strenuous muscle activity for nearly 1 minute. But again, I'm burning up huge amounts of glucose for very little return in this ATP. Okay, so huge amounts of glucose produce only a few ATP. Okay, and then here's your little picture here of, again, I break down my glucose. Okay, I'm going to get my pyruvic acids, but in this time I'm putting it into that anaerobic pathway and I'm producing only a small amount of ATP. And then we're going to look at what happens when we have the time and we're not at such a high intensity, and we can put that same amount of pyruvic acid, we can put it into the aerobic system. So here is aerobic respiration, and again, the biggest difference with this one is that it's going to require oxygen. So during rest and light to moderate activity, aerobic respiration is going to provide 95% of ATP for muscle activity. Okay, and again, this is one we want to use. And what you also find is that the better shape you're in, the more you're able to use this aerobic respiration. So that's the whole kind of point of training, is to get where I don't have to move into the anaerobic phases as quickly or at an intensity that if I train, it takes me a higher intensity to kind of get to where I have to switch out of this aerobic respiration. So we break bonds of fuel molecules and release energy to make ATP. Again, we're using glycolysis, okay? And aerobic respiration is going to take place in your mitochondria. And what I do is I have my glucose plus my oxygen, and then I get carbon dioxide, I get water, and then I get this ATP, okay? And the biggest thing you want to remember about this aerobic respiration, okay, is that I'm using oxygen, but I'm producing large amounts of ATP for every molecule of that pyruvic acid. Okay, so here's my aerobic pathway, and again, we're not looking at knowing all the steps of this like you might have learned like in high school. We just want to realize that, okay, we're using glucose, we're using oxygen, we're putting it into this aerobic pathway, and you can see that I get 32 ATP, whereas in the anaerobic one I only got 2. Okay, so I'm producing way more ATP, but I can only do that if my intensity level is a little bit lower. Okay. Alright, so energy systems during exercise. So based on energy demands, our bodies will always use aerobic pathways whenever possible. We talked about that. If exercise demands begin to exceed the ability of muscle cells to carry out their necessary reactions fast enough, I'm going to switch to a different system. Okay, so the anaerobic pathway is going to begin to contribute more and more ATP into the system. So it's all based on my energy needs, and again, it's based on these demands, but it's based on the intensity of whatever activity you're participating in. So now we get a few more little terminology things. We get aerobic endurance. So this is the length of time a muscle can continue to contract using these aerobic pathways. And again, you can increase your aerobic endurance with training, okay? And then we have this anaerobic threshold, and this is going to be the point at which muscle metabolism converts to anaerobic glycolysis. And again, this is going to be based on intensity or heart rate. You can do a lot of testing. In running, you can do a lot of like lactate threshold testing, where you can do all these little tests and you can kind of gradually increase the intensity that someone's running at. And what you're going to do is you're going to find that lactic acid is going to spike in their blood, and you're going to know that, okay, that is the point at which they have to sort of switch over and sort of start creating this ATP through these anaerobic pathways. Okay. And then again, you can tie that to heart rate. We do this a lot with especially the college kids with cross country. You're going to sort of find this lactic threshold, and you're going to match it to their heart rate, and then you can tell them, hey, when you're running or when you're in a race or when you're riding on your bike, as long as you stay below this heart rate, you're going to be using predominantly this aerobic pathway. As soon as you cross over into this higher heart rate, you're going to start to burn up that glucose, and you're going to have to start to use these anaerobic pathways. Okay, so here is just a little summary. So ATP and creatine phosphate, it's going to last me about 15 seconds. Okay, so this is for things that only last a very, very short amount of time. So surges of power, this is my weightlifting, short sprints, and especially if you're like a track and field person, you can think about, okay, how long does a 100-meter dash, a 60-meter dash, all these things that are going to be over before this 15 seconds are up. You're going to have these anaerobic pathways, and again, this is going to be my 45 seconds. And this is tennis, soccer, hockey. If you watch the Blackhawks, most shifts in hockey are going to last about 45 seconds. And then they're going to come and sit on the bench and replenish all these stores of ATP in their body. And then they're going to go out and skate hard for another 45 seconds. Okay. And this also kind of shows you that depending on my sport or my activity, I'm going to know what system is the most important to me, and I'm going to sort of train that system, right? So if you're doing, if you're a hockey player or a soccer player, and you know that you're going to have these 45-second, levels of intensity, you're going to train and you're going to do exercises that sort of imitate or mimic what you're going to be doing during your play. Soccer is a little bit trickier again because in hockey you get to go sit on the bench. Soccer is another one where you do have these bursts of high intensity, but you really don't get to ever rest, right? You're kind of on the field the whole time. So soccer is very, very much, they have to be just these amazing athletes because they have to sort of learn to recover while they're still moving, right? And if you ever go watch people play soccer, they're going to say that a professional soccer player is going to run 6 to 7 miles in a soccer game, okay? And a lot of that is going to be these short bursts, where they're a little bit longer, but they're at a high intensity for a certain amount of time, which makes them, some of the best athletes in the whole world. Aerobic pathways, anything greater than a minute. So this is my prolonged activity. Marathons, endurance athletes, and again, I'm using my glucose. I'm eventually, based on my level or the length of my activity, I can also start to sort of break down my fatty acids to produce that glucose and sort of produce that ATP over longer periods of time. For this, usually it's anything over like 90 minutes. When you get into 90 minutes, you're going to burn up all the glycogen you have stored in your body, and you're going to have to find another energy source. And then at that point, you're going to start breaking down your fats. Okay, and then here's just a little picture summary of all the things that we just talked about. Okay, so time-wise, which energy system you're using. And then the last thing we want to look at is muscle fatigue. So we looked at, okay, we have all this energy, why does our muscles sort of fatigue? And again, the definition of muscle fatigue is this physiological inability of a muscle to contract even though it might still be receiving stimuli. So everybody's kind of done these, especially in grade school where you're doing races and you kind of go too fast and you're tired after 200 meters and you still have another 200 meters to kind of go. And you're telling your body to move, but it just does not function properly. And again, you're trying to send that signal, but again, you just can't do it anymore. And this is the list of reasons that they think that it might be happening, okay? And the ATP decline, this is the one we used to think of, that we run out of ATP. But we've kind of learned that that's just not true, okay? So we always have some ATP. Your body always kind of keeps some ATP in reserve in case it desperately, desperately needs it. But we get this other little list here. And as you can see from these ones, they all have these little question marks after because they're not quite sure, okay? They're not quite sure what's kind of happening and why these different things happen, and it just shows you that we still have some things that we kind of need to figure out. What they're starting to think is the problem is that it's just these accumulations of all these byproducts from producing this energy, okay? So we get these little ionic imbalances through all these chemical reactions, and that's kind of what makes it where my muscles just can't fire properly, and I start to have problems and I start to fatigue a little bit faster. Okay, but it just shows even after all this time, we still have some things that we kind of have to figure out. But we know it's not that we run out of ATP. So now we get to training, and again, we said we can increase the efficiency, okay, of all these systems through training, and we want to know sort of what systems and what energy systems we're going to need for our particular sport, and then we want to train those to the best of our ability, okay. And what happens is as we do this, we just get better at delivering nutrients, okay, and we get better at what we just talked about, clearing out those byproducts that are produced by using these energy systems, okay. But again, it has to be specific to the sport that you're participating in. So if you're a high intensity sport, you have to do more high intensity training. If you're a lower intensity sport, you can do a little bit lower intensity training. So for my little guy who plays hockey, right, he does a lot of kind of intervals and sprints and things like that because that's more similar to what the demands are of his sport. If you're a distance runner, you can do, you're still going to do some high intensity stuff, but you're going to do a little more of that aerobic training. So these are the benefits, okay, or what happens to your body when you train in different ways. And again, this is aerobic exercise, okay, and these are the two things that really are the most important. And this happens with cross country runners all the time, where they just want to run fast all the time, and they kind of never run slow enough to kind of develop this aerobic system. But when I slow down and I train this aerobic system, and I go a little slower, but I run a little longer, I'm going to increase the number of capillaries that are going into my muscle fibers. Okay, so this is, those arteries are going to branch into these different capillaries, and I'm going to send all these branches into my muscles. That's an amazing thing that you want to sort of develop because it just, again, it allows me to deliver those nutrients and deliver that blood and that oxygen much, much better, even as I increase my intensity. Okay, so that's really, really, really important. If you don't develop this system, and you don't increase that branching of those capillaries into the muscle, you're limiting your maximum level of accomplishment as you get a little older. Okay, you're also going to get some increase in mitochondria. You're going to get some more myoglobin that'll allow you to carry more oxygen. And again, we're just trying to become more efficient at sort of creating this energy and again, sort of getting rid of those byproducts. Resistance exercising, so this will be my weight training. The biggest difference with this one is you're going to get the hypertrophy or the growth of the muscle. So you get an increase in the size of individual muscle fibers. Okay, it's not the number of fibers, it's just the size of the fibers. We're going to get more mitochondria, more myofilaments. We're going to be able to store more glycogen. Okay, and we're also going to, this is a really, really important one. Even for distance runners, this is a really, really important one, is that I'm going to strengthen this connective tissue, and it's going to make me a little more resilient or less prone to kind of getting injuries. Okay, so even the long distance runners, the marathoners, they're all doing resistance training. They're all doing high intensity training because they want to sort of strengthen that connective tissue and they want to be more powerful. Okay, and they want to develop all these systems. They're just going to concentrate on one a little bit more. This is kind of the bad part, and this is an interesting one. I took this seminar for cross country coaching, and you got to go to like the USA Olympic Training Center, and you got to listen to all these amazing coaches. And this was kind of the thing where you try to get your runners to be, you try to get them to not kind of take breaks, because cross country, especially in high school, kids will take like 3-4 months off and then they'll come back to running. But this kind of tells you that this deconditioning from your training, it happens really, 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 really quickly. Okay, so if an exercise routine is discontinued, and that can be for a bunch of reasons, right? It can be for injury, it can be where I'm just doing something different. The gains are going to be diminished. So everything you accomplish is going to start to diminish, and it's going to happen way quicker than we kind of thought, right? It's going to happen within 48 to 72 hours. Your training is going to start to kind of dissipate. And one of the really scary things is, if I break a bone or I sprain my ligaments and I have to be immobilized or I have to be in a cast or in a brace, immobilization is going to result in a strength decrease of 5% per day. So when you think about, okay, I'm in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks, losing my strength 5% per day is an enormous, enormous amount of strength loss, okay? And that's why when you get your arm out of a cast, the first thing that people notice is just how skinny your arm is because you've lost all that strength. Okay, so this is one of those things where you want to, again, try to be as active as possible, and even if you're taking a break, you still want to sort of do a little bit of conditioning so that you don't kind of lose all the gains that you accomplish kind of during your season.